So let's bring in Bob McTeer. He's former Dallas Fed president and fellow at the U.S. National Center for Policy Analysis. Our own senior economics reporter, Steve Leisman, joins us as well. Guys, good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Bob, I want to talk about Bernanke, what we're going to hear from him, taper versus tightening, succession. But first, just in light of the strong data we just saw with regard to home builder sentiment, higher rates here haven't appeared to derail home builder confidence. If anything, it seems like they're still quite hopeful that people are going to turn out here and buy homes.
If I had in mind buying a home anytime soon, the uptick in rates would get me off the dime. I wouldn't be a bit surprised to see it encourage buying in the short run.
Yeah, it's a great point. Now, speaking of rates, we're going to hear from the Fed chairman tomorrow. We're going to hear from him on Thursday. This is probably the last time that he'll be speaking before Congress in this fashion. But for the time being, I wonder if markets aren't vulnerable, Bob, to the confusion that still reigns about whether ending purchases or tapering purchases is the same thing as tightening policy. What's your view on that?
Well, it's not in the way he describes it. As long as, in my opinion, as long as he's buying stuff and the balance sheet is expanding, policy is eased. And if he buys a little less of it per month, it's still easy. It's just not quite as easy. And in his view, which I don't quite understand, but he does have it, in his view, if he stopped bond purchases altogether and froze the balance sheet of the Fed, that would lock in the present degree of ease. He would not regard that as tightening. So he's going to have to convince the world, and I think he's well on his way of doing so, that a taper in the quantitative easing portion of his policy is not really tightening, and it's separate from the interest rate portion, which he says will go on forever.
Steve, part of the issue lately seems to be that markets are hearing what they want to hear, which you could also argue is basically just taking new information about the economy into account. But that means that tomorrow could go either way.
It could, and I just want to answer Bob's question, and the question you asked to Bob, and the way I'd answer that is it depends on what the market understands. If the market has come to an understanding that tapering is not tightening, then I think we'll be okay tomorrow. But if the market believes that the Fed is off track now for a tapering in September, then I think we could be in for a surprise. To my belief, and I'm interested in what Bob thinks about this, I think the policy at the Fed right now, certainly that was the guidance from the press conference, from the meeting in May 22nd, is that the Fed will taper in September. And unless there is a change in the forecast that looks for a strengthening in the economy in the second half of this year, I think the Fed is probably still on track there. Now, if the market believes that that is not the case, then I think that maybe tomorrow or maybe over the next few weeks, if the economic data comes in that does point to a second half rebound, then I think the market's going to have to redigest the news that there's a tapering coming in September.
Yeah, I think, if you stop buying $85 billion a month and start buying 60, I mean, he could have come up with 60 originally. I mean, that number just came out of the air. Probably a week after he chose 85, he said, why did I go so high?
Bob, I agree with that sentiment in the sense that I think he wants to have the flexibility to move. I think he wants to have the ability to convince markets that 85 is not a be-all and end-all, that 65 is a possibility or 45 is a possibility, and that, yes, it still indeed is an accommodative policy in that regard. And when I read the minutes, it does seem, and you would know this better than I would, once the committee comes to some form of a consensus, there has to be a change in the data, a change in the forecast to move the committee off that consensus.
Yeah, the chairman's running out of time. He wants to get this course set before he has to leave in January. But I think in his speech to the National Bureau of Economic Research, he made some progress in being able to convince people that a tapering was not a tightening.
Bob, my concern is that that this is all very academic and really overcomplicating the situation. And actually, most people who are trading the market probably don't believe that QE has much of an effect on the economy at all. It's simply a trading signal. For as long as they're buying, the market is supported, the confidence is there, buy equities. If they're not buying, then don't buy equities because the confidence will ebb. It's almost, they painted themselves, Bob, into a corner where it's almost a binary result, regardless of what effect QE actually has on market sentiment. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think I would. Until recently, and maybe still, people have been confusing the Fed's QE purchases with a massive increase in the money supply. I think it's beginning to dawn on people that as hard as he's been pushing to get the money supply growing faster, it hasn't. It's growing less than 7% a year, and the velocity of money is going down about 3.5% to 4% a year. Money is not that easy in terms of what's getting to Main Street. What we've had so far with the QE is just balance sheet changes on the Fed's balance sheet and on commercial banks' balance sheets.
Simon, I'm sorry, but I'm just not so cynical about traders and the market. I think that these are new concepts, and I think the Fed has had a communications problem communicating these concepts and the differences in these concepts, and I think it's had some success, and I think it will continue to succeed at this.
I think your perception is very different because you're plugged into the Fed, and your perception is washed through with what they want
reacted,
people,
Simon. I've watched
with what they want people to believe, and the market doesn't hear what they're saying in the same way as you hear what the Fed is saying from the private conversations that you have. There's a disconnect.
Eventually they did hear it, and they've made the trade, and I still have a question, Simon, as to whether or not the market is believing in a September taper or not, but I think they've gotten this message that the Fed can reduce its purchases and still be helping the economy.
Oh, really? Well, we'll see about that. Thanks,
okay.
Steve. We'll see.
That is true. We actually will see. That is the true statement. Thank you. Thank you so much.